I'm going to call the meeting to order. Let's do a roll call.
Certainly. Mr. Williams,
Present.
Ms. Jordan Byron,
Present.
Ms. Wells,
Here.
Mr. Bryce,
Present.
Mr. Mushak,
Here.
Mr. Cantor,
Here.
Mr. Rowena,
Here.
and Mr. Shulman.
I'm here, but did you mention Ms. Tabachnik?
No, sorry, I don't see her. I saw her, now I don't see her. Ms. Tabachnik, thank you.
Here.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, so this is 2023-19 R/M Planning and Zoning Commission zoning text amendment for complete rewrite of the zoning regulations and map amendment for complete rezoning of the entire city. Let's take it topic by topic in the order we have on the agenda. The first being the zoning map and new single family zone. I believe everybody received the materials from the staff.
Yep.
All right, so the first one, as we were going through it, and a lot of the two-family zoning was kind of getting pulled back. One of the things that came up was adding back in a single-family zone, which would sort of duplicate the existing B residence zone. So the B residence zone is a single-family only zone with a minimum lot size of 6,250 square feet. So what that would end up looking like in terms of the proposed zoning and the nomenclature for now is the AAA residence zone would remain being called the CD3L. And then we'd add back in a minimum lot size of an acre, which is what exists today. The AA and A residence zone would become, it's going to sound new, but it's not in terms of dimensions, is the CD3M, M kind of meaning medium. And that would have a minimum lot size of 12,500 square feet, which is a quarter acre, which is what the A residence zone has required today. And then the CD3S, while the name of the zone isn't new, this is the technically new zone with the that's going to mimic the B residence zone with a minimum lot size of 6,250 square feet. And so then what would that look like on the map, and I know this might be hard to see, is this sort of beigeish orange is going to be what is going to be the CD3S, which is the B residence zone equivalent, and it pretty much lines up exactly with where the B residence zone is today. So there's no change proposed in terms of certain areas becoming this zone instead of CD3M. So this kind of mirrors what is existing today.
But I see that Hector's joined us. I think everyone but Tammy is here now.
And then as let me zoom out here to see where we went next with the memo. So there was a couple of concerns that we still had received, Cottage Street being one of them. A couple folks who live down there still expressed that they would not like to get upzoned from the existing C residence zone into the CD4. Staff's perspective is it still makes sense to put it into the CD4 based on these maps here. So here's the Cottage Street area. It's all C residence zone today, which allows for 1 and 2 family residences. And the map on the right is sort of the existing uses in that area. So the pink is a multifamily property, orange is a 2-family property, and the yellow is a single family property. So you can see it's a good mix of each. So what that means is technically all of these pink properties today are considered non-conforming. They're not allowed in that zone in the C residence zone today. So it makes sense to bring that area into the CD4, which allows for the multifamily, which would legalize all of these properties and make them conforming. And then what that does for the 1 and 2s is they remain conforming, and those property owners, should they choose, could either convert their house to a single family, or keep it as a single family, convert it to a duplex, or possibly a triplex, depending on how much lot area they have.
Makes sense to me.
And then again, just based on where it is in the city, it's very close to the East Norwalk train station. It's next to the EVTZ. All of this, Van Zant, Rowan, this is all allowing for multifamily today. So it kind of abuts those types of uses. So it's not out of character for the area. It sort of fits right in with what we're proposing.
That's what I miss in middle.
I'm
Yeah,
sorry.
that makes sense to me, except for the issue of still not having movement on the residential parking passes for that area.
Say, by the way, have we determined that residential parking passes are legal?
They exist right now. People will say they don't, but they do. There was like a secret program. I don't know, but there was a program not 2 years ago. You'd go down to the parking office across from the aquarium and you had to register your car. There are streets in Norwalk, East Norwalk, that have it. And when I communicated with Jim Travers about it, don't quote me on this because I don't have the emails in front of me, but it was basically like, that wasn't a real thing, or that it's not being managed, or I don't know, that it somehow, but it existed. It was, I believe it still exists, that you can go down there and register your car so that you're allowed to park on certain streets. And it's about expanding it and figuring out the best way to do it. And there was a recent article that they've now hired somebody who's researching it, but it also said, quoted Mr. Travers, something like it might not be happening anytime soon, or it might not be a good idea. And I think particularly for East Norwalk, the way that it was presented in the recommendations for the TOZ, the way the streets are so small, that it's really important. It's not just about limiting parking from non-residents, but it's also about ways to limit, excessive cars, possibly from illegal rooming houses and broken up apartments that crowd the streets. And Cottage Street, I think everything you say there makes sense. I will fundamentally support it, but it's tight down there around that corner.
Yeah,
I'm very concerned about not moving forward.
Yeah, I think that the thing to keep in mind is how the existing neighborhood already, I mean, a lot of these are already multifamily. So that, that is, at the end of the day, is probably a net gain. I mean, each of these single family properties, should they choose to ever convert to a multifamily property under this, maybe adds 2 units each. So you're talking about maybe 12 potential new units in the whole area. And then you're bringing all of this into, conformity. And then with any conversions, they're having to provide the additional off-street parking spaces for those new units that they add. I mean, kind of the whole goal and concept of this is that based on proximity to the train station, based on proximity to retail and personal service shops, you're reducing car trips at the end of the day. I mean, they might still need to drive to the grocery store, but if one trip to the, grocery store is all they're making, then that's a, improvement over how much people are driving today.
Yeah, I get it. I think most importantly, making that street is so mixed that the opportunity to make those properties conforming is important. But I think there's a bigger picture issue in East Norwalk related to the residential parking passes, which comes up anytime you're adding more people and potentially more cars to an area that everybody has agreed for years and years needs a residential parking pass system of some sort. And it's done in many cities. There's no legal issues. It's about how do you implement it and having the political will to move it forward.
Anna, I don't disagree with you, but our role in establishing that is limited. We can recommend, but we can't implement. That is the purview of our traffic and parking folks.
Yep, I understand.
Okay, then, since there doesn't seem to be any disagreement on that change, let's move on to the next item.
Okay. The other area, this is kind of just to make you all aware. On Elton Court, we had one property owner who lives in that area. She just reached out to let us to request that the city look into potentially one-waying, whether it was Elton Court or Hendricks. So we're going to have TMP kind of look at that. I think it makes sense. She didn't really express any yay or nay towards the potential going from single family to two family. It was just more of looking at the traffic flow, and so we're going to have TMP again take a look at that, just to let y'all know.
Did she mention anything about Sherry? I wonder of that, like folks being able to make a left turn out of Sherry, for example, onto East Ave, especially during peak periods. So
right, yeah,
be included. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think if you look at any of this, I think, you know, if you're one-weighing anything, so Sherry would have to either be an entrance or an exit. You'd have to, yeah. So I think that'll all get encompassed into that.
Cool. Yeah, I think the other one is a signal, so it might be easier to make that left turn.
Right, absolutely.
Brian, vis-a-vis Anna's concern and Chapin's comment here, are we passing on to TMP hard recommendations that you know, this is important to us, or are we simply saying, would you please look at this?
Sorry, Brian.
Yeah, go ahead.
For Elton Court, we asked them to look at it. We didn't give a recommendation regarding the circulation. Figured that was probably, you know, better left to them to take a deep dive at. For the
Sure.
Parking passes, though, we did talk to them about that, and there were conversations at higher levels as well. And I know that there's been conversations with the mayor's office about that, and with the related to the police department's role and this, you know, with the parking enforcement on that too. So I think there's just more moving pieces with that particular issue as opposed to what was going on with Elton Court.
Okay, thank you, Steve.
All right, then the last issue. So this was a property owner, or I guess properties owner, similar to some of the other requests that you had gotten of, can I please have my properties in this zone as opposed to this zone? It's over on Main Street and West Main. Let's see if I put a map in. I did. So property owner owns this conglomeration of properties. So this is 125 through 131 Main Street. This is Main Street. And then this is 2 and 4 West Main Street going west. So this is kind of what those parcels look like today, at least the West Main Street one. So generally maybe, you know, triplexes, duplexes, and what they're asking to do is they have this concept in place where they would like to build some sort of hotel structure, and then they want to build a multifamily behind it. They want 2 and 4 West Main Street to be in the CD4C, which is the red zone, this red color. And what they gain out of that is additional height, and they gain a slight bump in density. The density, if you were to look at the CD4C versus just the CD4, it would net them a gain of potentially 4 residential units. So really the more concerning thing to look at is the height gain that they'd get. So they could still develop this as a hotel with a multifamily structure as one development. But what would happen is if you had 2 and 4 West Main included into the CD4C, is this whole structure could essentially be 6 stories. You know, staff's perspective is I think that proposed zoning here is appropriate. It scales down where they could have a larger structure and along Main Street, and then they could go down to a 3.5 story structure. At this portion, it would naturally scale with the rest of the neighborhood. So we just wanted to put it out there. What did you guys think in terms of keeping it as proposed, which is CD4C on Main Street, and then CD4 going along West Main, versus the applicant's request of grouping in 2 and 4 West Main into the CD4C?
Brian, can you give us a broader view physically of?
Yeah, can we go to Google Map. I'm trying to find this on regular Google Maps. I'm having trouble. Where is West Main? I feel
West
silly.
Main is the lower, by the lower portion of Main Avenue, US Route 7.
It's Main Ave. Duh. Sorry.
Yeah.
I always say Main Street.
Well, it's like the where
Wait,
before
where
it
is it?
turns into Main Ave. Yeah,
Am I bringing up Google Maps, Brian?
But
So we can all...
didn't you have a picture of it right below your description?
yeah. I think it might be too close to like give that perspective.
So it's over here by the
So-
Goldfish. Okay, so it's where I had. So it's the corner,
Right, so they
right
own-
across from the Goldfish.
Right. Yep. Here's Goldfish. So they own these parcels, which are currently business 2 zone, CD4C proposed, and they want this parcel here and this parcel here to get grouped in with that. So then you could kind of see the larger parcel that they would accumulate.
That
Is
makes sense
this,
to
is
me.
this the same area where years ago they wanted to put in a gas station?
Oh, yeah.
Cumberland Farms.
Yeah, exactly.
And the neighbors across West Main Street came out in force. They didn't want to have the exit opposite there. You can see it in this photo that you're showing. There's a couple of buildings right there. Yeah, I can't. My cursor doesn't work. I'm sitting here like circling it, but anyway, the Cumberland Farms was turned down because it was considered out of scale and meant big impacts on the historic neighborhood behind. Yeah, that's where that's where a lot of effort has been put into historic preservation.
I think we have the same problem with this. I'm not sure that that's a location for a 6-story building. And I mean, this improves the value of the property for them. And I assume that's what they're interested in. But I don't think it's good planning from our perspective.
And I think you can kind of get like a perspective, like the existing neighborhood along West Main. You
Right.
see, like it does have multifamily, but it's like small height scale. So I mean, if you could try to like picture a 6-story structure adjacent to this one, it might, seem a little daunting.
Yeah, it does seem out of place. And so this is West Main. Because initially I was thinking Main Street, but no, they wanted on West Main Street. Okay.
Right.
And
Yeah, I like the
It's both, JJ. Because you have Main Street. It's on Main Street and West Main.
Oh, okay. That
Yeah, I don't think there's
okay.
anything over
All right.
at the most where the Goldfish is, and that's I think like 3 stories. I don't think there's anything that tall in the area.
Yeah, I think that was what I was going to ask. The current B2 zone, Brian, what's 4 or 4.5?
Yeah, the current B2 lets you go up to, I believe it's 4.5.
Does somebody have their?
Yeah, can someone please mute who is having a whole conversation in the room? Thank you.
Yeah, the current B2 zone
Couldn't
max
hear it.
height, I believe, it's 4 or 4.5 stories. So that's the difference there.
Oh, so it exceeds.
That's something
Okay.
else you guys might just want to think about in the back of your minds. Is that 6 too much, or do we want to scale
think
that
it's-
back or put some constraints on it?
I don't mind it.
Yeah, I don't mind it along Main Street there, but I think on West Main Street it makes sense to keep that as its proposed CD4. We've talked a lot about like wanting to have from the frontage, from the street, having it consistent on both sides. Like as you turn down West Main Street, it should like have that residential look, whereas Main Street is more of a like commercial corridor, so it may have more of that look instead.
It would be nice to settle this so that we don't have to revisit it. Why don't we do a straw poll? How many people find this objectionable and would rather not approve it? Why don't we do just raising hands?
Mr. Schulman, do you mean
Yes.
with what was proposed by the landowner, or what?
By the property owners.
I see. Okay. So
Okay.
yeah, say it again. Sorry.
This is those who are opposed to the suggestion being made by the property owners as to how we zone it.
Thank you.
Oh, I see. Oh,
Okay,
Just
so-
those 2 properties on West Main, not everything else. You're just talking about those.
Right. Exactly.
right. I mean, okay, so yeah, I was like the wording capping it at 4 feet. I would support it. Yes.
Okay. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I count that right? It's either 6 or oh no, 7. All right. So we're not going to do that. Let's move on to the next item.
Well, and it's still possible though, Steve, right? You said that they could still put a hotel if they wanted a hotel. Seems
Right.
like-
So the
stories.
so the difference, maybe this is what we should discuss. I don't know if we should do it now or at another time. Is the height for the CD4C, but so they could still do a hotel in that both zones. It's just the difference in height. It's really the
Right.
That was it for that memo.
Okay.
Brian, before we move on, do we want to talk about, we did talk about this at the last meeting, but I just want to talk about how we think about rolling the change out to the public. We talked about reversing the transect, and instead of going for the single families, instead of using 3S, 3M, and 3L, changing that to 1, since it's a single family, and then the 2 family would be 2, which I think everybody said made more sense. So it's just a question of when we get to the public hearing stage, do we want to roll that out now with like a nice, hopefully crystal clear memo that says here's what we changed and why we changed it? I mean, at some point they're going to have to think about it, and it's going to be, oh, what are they doing now kind of thing. I'm trying to avoid that. I think we can make it make sense, but just want to make sure everybody on your end is on the same page before we go that direction.
I think it makes sense to do it sooner rather than later. Get the information out there.
I agree.
And then stick with whatever it is to reduce the confusion.
Yeah, the consultant is adding the new zone back in and changing. We finally grudgingly got them to agree to change all the nomenclature. So they're going to make that change, add that back in, and then we're going to get some of the use table changes to put in, and then have red line edits in the document so everybody can see what all the other changes are going to be. So hopefully there'll be a PDF, they can click on it and they can see on page 65 they're changing this sentence. Hopefully it's a clear package. So Brian and I will start working on that in the next week or so.
Okay.
So just to be clear, okay, because I thought that the SML was something we recently adopted. And so now we want to go back to 1, 2, 3. Just want to make sure that's
no. So the SM&L will remain the same for the single family, but under the current draft, it really goes to their whole form-based transect thing where single families are considered a 3. So there's 3 L, M, and S. But from our perspective, we're like, well, single family. Most people would think 1 is single family, so we're going to change the 3 to a 1.
Okay. All right, and then duplexes to multifamily.
It'll line up really nicely because you'll have the CD 1L, 1M, 1S, and then the 2 family zone would become CD2, which makes sense, and then CD3 is multifamily, multi anyway, so it kind of all makes sense.
All right,
I think we're good with that, Steve.
We're good with that.
I think Steve, Steve, I think we should do it now. If it's possible, not just a memo like the other memos you've been doing, but like, you know how when you first get to the landing page for the regulation update, they've got those great explainers of something there.
Yeah.
Those were really easy to understand.
Yeah, you're right. And I was thinking about some of those memos we might need the older ones, we probably need to take down or seriously gut, just because they're kind of outdated at this point and they might confuse people more than help people at this stage. So that's on my list of things to do next week or the week after.
Okay. Now we're dealing with parking.
Or we could do development parcels, which is Article 5, whichever one you want to jump into.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. Yeah, I said myself we'd stay in order. That's fine.
So this one, I'll share screen. Development parcels is Article 5 in the regulations, and this is a new concept for staff as well. So kind of the idea was there would be these large developments, essentially a 7.5 acre development, and this would sort of lay out, it originally proposed to lay out how you would design streets and sidewalks and all of those kind of things. And then you'd create these walk sheds within that development. It would dictate different building types that you'd have to have a certain mix of. And then as we started to sort of dig more into the regulations, TMP was getting started on their complete streets plan, and it made more sense from our perspective that if somebody's coming in and proposing to build a new street, that it would fall under the complete streets plan, as that's a document that would TMP would have jurisdiction over, and that could be edited based on best practices for street design and sidewalks and all that kind of stuff, rather than putting into the zoning regulations where if best practices change on how wide sidewalks should be or all that kind of stuff, now you have to do an amendment to your zoning regulations. So it kind of makes more sense for that to be its own set of standards outside of the zoning regs. So once that, was pulled out of the draft of the proposed regs, this section got a little bit hollow. It kind of just really talked about for these type of developments, kind of a building type mix that you would have to have, and then location of civic spaces. So we started to think maybe it makes sense to delete this whole section. Another reason why is a 7.5 acre development in Norwalk is going to be very difficult to achieve. There's not many 7.5 acre parcels that really exist without somebody having to accumulate many properties and proposing to do one of these developments. So I put, like, for perspective, this was the Pinnacle lot. So here's the Norwalk, the art space, the Sono art space. This is where they're building Pinnacle. The site is 4.5 acres, so it would not count as a development parcel. It wouldn't meet the 7.5 acre requirement. The Webster Street lot, which is this whole piece of property here, is 5.5 acres. So this also would not meet a 7.5 acre development. So kind of what we're thinking is it makes sense to delete this section. If a development were to ever come in that's 7.5 acres and they wanted to put new streets in, essentially they'd abide by the proposed regulations, which discusses all sorts of the building types that they could put in, the uses that they could put in, dependent on that zone, public realm space, open space. The complete streets plan will hopefully be finalized by that time. So they'd have a complete streets document that would tell them how to design their street layouts and public right of way and all that kind of stuff. So we're thinking that this section might no longer be necessary, and it might help also, make the zoning regs a little bit thinner, which helps everybody sort of understand, I think, in terms of clarity of the regulations.
I think there's a few areas in town that might be like single properties that are bigger than that, like the golf courses, and maybe I can't really tell from Google Maps here, but where the power plant is, the old power plant down by South Norwalk. Yeah.
Some of the Route 1 parcels are too.
Okay, that's good to know. I did like how this incorporated the requirement of the civic space. With the complete streets, would that be a component that would be required by that, or is that something that would be dependent on zoning?
So it would be dependent on zoning, because the civic space was more of, if you're proposing one of these developments, that you would have to designate a certain percentage of the development as like a park or a gathering space, whereas the complete streets is really going to stick to that public right of way. those improvements.
Yeah, I'm all for making the regulations as simple as possible. So like if there are things we can remove that aren't that aren't useful, helpful, we absolutely should.
And as far as I know that this Article 5 only applied to mixed use zones. So for example, the golf course, whichever golf course you're speaking of. So Oak Hill
guesses, yeah,
like civic zone, and so this would not apply to it. And then the other two golf courses would technically be zoned. I think they're technically zoned as single family. So again, that this article would not apply to those.
I see.
Okay. Does this apply to the Norden piece if they came in with something?
Technically, yes. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And what about Lakota? That's residential, or that's some kind of hybrid out there?
That would be a residential zone, so it would not apply to Lakota Oaks.
What do we lose by taking this out?
So what you lose would be if someone were to come in, really at the end of the day, it's going to be the civic space requirement. So I mean, if they came in with a development, I would think, for example, with North 7 came in and they essentially proposed to put in some sort of civic space. But you lose, I guess, I don't know if guarantee is the right word, but the requirement in there, although I would think if somebody came in with a development like that they would want to put in, or that you guys would require them to do it anyways. And then sort of like a minimum mix of different building typologies. So it would say, like, for example, only 60% of the structures could be large scale multifamily, and the other 40% would have to be mixed use or something like that.
I think that, Brian, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think where you only lose that public realm component is really in the 4C zone, which is basically Main Ave and Route 1, because we did put in a while back the requirement that the mixed use developments or the residential developments had to put in a public realm component as part of them, regardless of whether they were a development parcel or not. So I think it's probably like if somebody came in with another Home Depot shopping center on like 8 acres, that would probably be the only scenario where you might not get that civic space component.
So in general, my first instinct here was to take it out, but I'm thinking back to some of the recent projects, particularly from one of the attorneys, Ms. Suchi, where it was very clear that it was like, nope, your regulation doesn't require this. We're going to have cell phone charging stations instead of solar panels. Nope, we don't have to do that. It's nice that you guys would like a dog park, but no. So that's my only concern, that taking it out on the hope that if this should ever happen, somebody would volunteer to do one of these things, having the mixed type of buildings or whatever, or would be open to our recommendations, I think is taking a big leap of faith.
But I think we can solve that differently. Steve, Brian, couldn't we solve that by putting different requirements in the 4C, like civic space or something like that?
Yeah, so it is, and then we can go back and clarify the language. If we don't do it tonight, we'll get it to you for the next meeting. But I'm pretty sure that we did put in, and maybe when Brian's going over the next memo, I'll search ahead. But I think we did put in the requirement that the public realm space was required for any development that was. I'm pretty sure any development that was proposing residential had to have a public realm component into. But I'll confirm that what the language we use.
And I think that could solve both problems and not have this sort of potentially random piece in there. So I totally agree. The site plan, once something's legal, the site plan, we don't have much authority.
Okay. It sounds like we can pull this out pending your review.
Well, is the only reason it's being pulled out just to make the code shorter?
No, I think the overall applicability of it, I mean, I don't know if you'll ever see a development come in that takes advantage of this. But for the most part, it not only the applicability, but just what it actually requires is not a lot. It's really that minimum amount of civic space and then a mix of building typologies. So whether that's valuable or not, I mean, I'm sure there's some value to it, but whether or not it's, it'll ever see the light of day, I'm not 100% sure.
Well, there is a couple of pieces that this would apply to, and it kind of made me laugh when I was listening to Anna, because she's absolutely right about Liz's presentation that night. To save 13 pages, I think this was, given the overall size and complexity of the zoning code, I don't see it as, worth it to take it out for that reason. But if there's other reasons, then I'm kind of ambivalent about it, but I'm inclined to, if it's not hurting anything, to leave it.
Steve, is there a way of dealing with the other issue about the building topologies so that we could remove this, but still have those two important sections addressed?
Yes, you could certainly you can certainly have that public realm standard in any of those zones, and clarify what you want for public realm.
Or an asterisk that says, and if the project is over 7.5 acres, these 3 things apply.
Right. My one concern is, I think we've seen it historically, well, not historically, but in recent years, is when you put those minimums, like, so say, all right, if your development is a 7.5 acre development, it triggers these additional requirements. Most people are going to be like, okay, well, my development is going to be 7.4 acres.
Yeah, break it into 2 or make it so I think we make it across the board to avoid the get out of jail, to skirt around that. Because there's nothing that would prevent people from saying, these 3 buildings are project owned by Norwalk 1, and these are owned by Norwalk 2, and they're 2 separate applications.
Right. Okay.
Yeah, they could do that under this scheme as well. I mean, I'm fine with making it apply across the board, but the way it's currently set
anytime
up,
we put a minimum, they can do it. There's nothing.
This section only applies to things that are 7.5 acres. So people can build it 7.4 to avoid this section. But I'm fine with whatever, either applying it to everything or just some things. I'm just concerned about taking it out because it's unlikely to happen.
Let's move on, but let's revisit this when we see what the staff is recommending in its place. Okay, so we'll come back to it when we see how the staff has been able to address our concerns.
Okay.
Okay.
The next one is parking.
Right.
That one up. So this was done by my colleague Amelia. So it's all right, and it's not broad-based parking like for everything. This is parking related to specific uses. So the 3 in particular are funeral homes, places of worship, and then commercial recreation establishments. Each of these kind of has their own unique qualities when it comes to parking, and it's kind of hard to quantify each one the same. One person's place of worship is going to have different parking than another person's place of worship. So Amelia went in and took a long time, a lot of work to do this, is to go to each town and kind of see what they require versus what we're proposing to require for each of these uses. And then kind of see if there's any sort of similarities or best practices. So the first one is funeral homes. I believe our proposed regulation was based on the floor area of the funeral home, which is tricky. I don't know if that's, and if you're looking at a parking standard for a funeral home, if floor area is the best way to determine that. So I think what we had come up with is it might be best to look at what the fire marshal requires in terms of like a max occupancy for your building. And then we could park it at 1 per every 3 seats. That way, for funerals, at the funeral home, it's kind of given that there is a maximum amount of people that technically could occupy the building, and then there'd probably be, grouping up to go there. So, maybe this is a good alternative to using a strictly like a 1 per 100 square feet of floor area calculation.
Yeah, the problem with funeral homes often are the wakes, where literally hundreds of people want to attend, and we have long lines coming out the door, which means people are parked all over the place, and I'm not sure how you can address that.
Yeah, I don't think we can.
But Lou, does that happen? I haven't seen. I've been, especially the last couple of years, been to a couple of funerals, and for the wakes, when it happens at the funeral home, I haven't seen that many because they stagger over hours. When it happens at a church, like a Catholic church, that's where you see the big numbers. So I don't know if this applies to the funeral home. I like the rule, like the what Wilton does, the 3 seats per car. And what I've seen is, interestingly, is like very orderly, where most families. And I remember going to a networking event, and I think it was the owner of Colin's funeral, where he was trying to get more people in, because he said, especially say like the Latino community, right? That's the groups that will bring the most people to a funeral home. But most of those usually go to either Stamford or Bridgeport. So for Norwalk, it's still on the low numbers, and I don't know, maybe we can get someone from that industry to inform us how their numbers come in, because they actually have numbers for attendance.
I like using the maximum occupancy as a metric instead of floor area, maybe even more generally than just funeral homes. I didn't see that before. I like that.
I like what Hector had to say by having a industry expert help us with this information that will inform our decision making.
We should just abolish all parking requirements to make our life so much easier.
Well, or set maximums instead.
Abolish all of them. Thank you.
Mike here. The one danger of using the maximum occupancy is overbuilding of parking, right? That's what happens with Walmarts, and although I don't want to use the Walmart that we currently have on Connecticut Avenue as an example, because that parking lot is always full. But one of the whole philosophies of the overbuilt parking in this country is based on maximum occupancy. Like a shopping mall has acres of parking that usually sits empty, except at the holidays, for instance. And so using maximum occupancy is going to lead to an overbuilt parking situation, probably. I mean, most of these funeral homes are in older, a lot of them are in preserved older homes, at least in Norwalk, right? And they're in neighborhoods where it can be tight. I've always found this spot, been to many funerals, sadly, but in Norwalk, but I've never had a situation where I couldn't find a parking spot. Like Mott Street, tend to always be able to park in that neighborhood. And anyway, I don't know. I'm ambiguous, like Richard was on the last one.
These are all difficult. That's why they're here.
All of the funerals that I have been to, there either is adequate parking, or if it's somebody that's really popular, there is inadequate parking. But unlike a church, unlike a mass, it doesn't run from 12 to 1 or 11 to 12. It's, you know, generally all day. And my experience has been, if there's an overflow, there's usually some representative of the funeral home telling you to get lost and come back later, or showing you, you know, who the person is that's going to park your car. So, you know, my particular feeling is that they should pick a number that, you know, seems like off the face it would work, and then let the funeral homes run it. They're the ones that have to have the business. I mean, on East Avenue, where there were funeral homes, there was cooperation between the property owners adjacent to the funeral homes. You know, they would call and say, hey, can we use your parking lot after 6 o'clock or something? And there usually wasn't a problem. But some of the ones are by themselves, and that are surrounded by uses that are like apartment buildings or something that really can't do that.
But the fact is, the existing funeral homes will be grandfathered.
Will be grandfathered anyway, exactly.
Exactly. So we're only talking about new facilities.
Yeah, and I guess what we could do too is, so yeah, I mean, we have an existing standard in the regs, which is one space per 60 square feet of usable area. I guess usable area meaning space designated for the public. Maybe it makes sense for us to take a look and see which one is less. That might be the, you know, least burdensome on the funeral home owners or any prospective funeral home operators.
Well, Brian, you have these numbers from the other communities. Have you asked the question about what their actual experience is with these regulations? Do they find that they handle the majority of funerals, or are there still problems, or is it their judgment that these have left too many parking spaces vacant?
I'm going to guess a lot of it has to do with what Mr. Rowena was saying. When you have, you know, if there's a large event for somebody that was particularly well known or popular or something, more than likely there's spillover onto other properties or onto other streets based on the demand for that particular event. But I think by and large, those events are pretty far and in between. They're not daily activities or daily occurrences. And oftentimes the wakes occur off hours too. So they might be in the evening. So it's already after, you know, the rush or something like that. So I don't think you want to overpark for these things. And my guess is that I don't know when the last time there's been a new funeral home actually built or come online. And you know, it seems like these establishments are the same ones that have been in the same places for 50 plus years. It's not like it's not like a new business that comes online very often, if at all.
Right.
We can run the numbers. We can look at see if we can pull two of the funeral homes and look at the proposed versus existing and come back to you with a quick little summary of that.
Okay. All right. So we'll have to revisit this one.
All right. And then the next one was places of worship. Another tricky one in terms of parking. I believe, so the existing standards that we have in our regulations are one space per 5 seats. And then it gives another calculation. If you don't have fixed seating, this is how you would calculate it. So sort of what we were proposing, I believe here was one space. I'm trying to see how Amelia worded this. I believe it was one space per 3 seats, and then acquiring an additional space for employees.
Why are we trying to make it more restrictive?
The main issue is that when that standard had occurred of the 1 per 4, it's just, I think that the religious institution dynamic in general has shifted. So it's not the mom, mother, father, 2 children going to church. It's a lot more single vehicle ridership, or 2, maybe 1 per 2. So I think that it's just the standard is more consistent with what actually occurs.
From my perspective, a relatively recent application that we had for a new church was an eye-opener, in the sense that the calculation is based on the maximum allowable people, and that number is picked by the owner of the building and then enforced if somebody calls and complains by the fire department. I think there should be a different way of determining the starting number than having the applicant say what the maximum allowed is.
I thought the fire marshal determined that number.
The fire marshal will, what happened the last time was there was space that would allow, I'm just going to pick numbers off the top of my head because I can't remember.
Yeah, we're talking about the Guardera, right?
Say again?
You're talking about the Guardera?
Well, I don't want to talk about a specific one, but yes. There was a number that was calculated by me based on the square footage that was available for, based on the plans that were submitted for our approval. And what was submitted to the fire marshal's office was that there would be a maximum number of X people. And the fire marshal says, okay, that's your maximum number then. And as long as that number is less than what the square footage would allow, then the fire marshal says, okay. But the problem with that is, especially in some churches where people don't sit down on chairs, they stand on the floor or sit on the floor, then any space that's open is going to be utilized. And the only way the fire marshal is going to be able to do anything about it is if one of the parishioners calls and says there's too many people in here. And I doubt that'll happen. So I think that equation or that means of arriving at a number should be eliminated from calculation for these things.
Richard, how would you suggest that we do the calculation?
Well, if the church supplies plans, and you look at the plans, and there is 4,000 square feet open in front of the altar, then that is what should be considered the maximum area, not we're only going to have 60 people here. I just think that it should be I always get these two words confused. I'm not sure if it's objective or I think it's objective. It should be an objective way of looking at it, not information relied upon and supplied by the owner of the building.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, if you're saying that a seat consists of, let's say, 6 square feet or 60 square feet, whatever the number is, it should be a calculation that's required to be given by the architect.
But isn't, to play devil's advocate a second here, like,
no pun intended.
No pun intended, exactly. The notion there, requires what it takes away is, space that isn't intended for people to sit there, whether it's just common space or other activities or other things. You're effectively saying the entire square footage of the building needs to be deemed that it's going to, be filled in by a person. And I'm not sure that's true, right? That's the thing I'm struggling with. I struggle with parking requirements anyway, because I feel it's mostly just guessing. And anyway, it's make-believe. But for this particular one, I worry if, how are you going to define that? If I put an individual chair versus a pew, if I can fit, I I don't know. I worry that this really slippery slope there. I
agree with you, Nick, but if you have an applicant that has hired an engineer and an architect to submit plans, and there is a calculation that is available to make that decision. I mean, we're looking at what all of the other towns require. If there is a calculation that's available, it just doesn't seem to me that it would be that difficult and that subjective to use that calculation. Would that force them to use every space for parishioners? I don't know, but what I do know, looking out my window, is that on Sundays and on big holidays and on funeral times, the 250 parking spaces that are out there are insufficient. Now, does that happen all the time? No, it doesn't. And it really isn't that big a problem for me because they're not allowed to park on the street, so they park all over the grass that's there. But I keep thinking about the approval we did on Richards Avenue. 54 parking spaces for an 18,000 square foot building is astounding to me. But
the whole building wasn't the cloister. I don't know what you call it in that building, but like in a church, you have the cloister, so to speak. Where the pulpit is, and all the pews. And on holidays, I'm sure there are people standing in the aisles on the sides. I've seen that when I've gone to funerals. I've never gone to a church like that on a holiday. So there are probably a lot of people, and it's probably overflow. But you can't ask them to calculate the lunchroom downstairs into it.
And I wasn't doing that. When I said what I said before, the numbers are coming back to me now. I am not an engineer, but I certainly know how to use a calculator. And according to my calculations, the floor space that was available should have given rise to 120 car parking space. But based on the calculations that were done by the applicant, they knew they could only get 54 cars. So they said, okay, our maximum allowable is going to be whatever it worked out to for 54 cars. And I just don't think that's right. It's legal because they do it, but I don't think it's right.
Maybe it's something like for these, for what we're really talking about is places that have intermittent capacity and use.
Well, that's true, but the places that we're talking about, and I'm going to shut up after this. I didn't mean to dominate this discussion. But the places that we are talking about, for instance, the last application was a 1 acre building lot surrounded by 1 acre building lots that had this proposal for 18,000 square foot building and 54 parking spaces on a 1 acre lot with septic and a well. To me, I've said it before, I didn't think it was right, but it did fit the code at the time. And I think there should be a major change to what the churches are allowed to do in Norwalk in terms of minimum lot size and what they're allowed to build on it.
So thinking with that and thinking more broadly, not just about whatever the recent situation was, for places like houses of worship and maybe even funeral homes or robot conventions, I know that's on the list, that don't have regular use, maybe it's something like X number of spots per seat or per use, whatever it is, plus a plan for overflow parking on site, or an agreement with a neighborhood. We tried to do that in changing the zoning code, or are you talking about a specific application that's up?
No, I'm talking about changing the zoning code. I think that there should be some relationship between the size of the building and the size of the building lot, and forget about, no, I don't want to say forget about, but not give as much consideration to RLUIPA and a house of worship in terms of lot coverage. I mean, you could never build a single family house on a 1 acre lot like that temple that was approved.
Steve, is it possible to have a type of parking regulation that says it's this and this and this with a written plan for overflow parking that doesn't involve street parking?
Most of the churches are able to do that, and it's simply because probably at the time the land was purchased, I'm not going to even say probably, at the time the land was purchased, it was a lot cheaper than it is now. But like for instance, the smallest lot, the smallest religious building, as I recall, was 3 acres. And the neighbors were complaining about the parking on that one. I know that for a fact. But that was 3 acres. This was 1 acre with a very large.
I'm just not sure if that type of thing, Steve, is that type of thing allowed? Could something be written that way?
Yeah, well, the regulations already now allow for you can obtain easements for parking if you can't park everything on your property. The problem, and this does get to an application specific issue, was that they could not obtain any viable offsite parking, which ran into problems. So it's like they didn't have any ability for overflow parking. There wasn't a spot that could accommodate.
So we already have this requirement.
Yeah, it's an allowance, not not even a requirement. But they've got to provide the minimum. But if you can't provide the minimum, there are abilities to provide offsite parking. If it's in the regulations, it's in a single family residential zone, that's going to be much trickier to accomplish that if you're downtown on West Avenue and there's 10 other parking lots within a quarter mile of your site.
Right. I think that the temple, the Sikh temple, had a plan for shuttling people from Norwalk Community College up to the site on Richards Avenue if there was overflow parking.
That was something that was in discussions but never happened.
But that's okay. And then I'm getting confused about what the problem is. And I'm more interested in thinking about this in terms of generalities than a specific application in the past, or even specifically religious institutions, or like there are multiple places that have this intermittent parking issue. Should it be calculated based on seats or floor space or pews or whatever? Like, I don't know. The more and more I listen, the more confused I get. Let's put it that way.
It could easily come up again. Anytime there's a single family house for sale in an a AAA residence zone, unless the zoning regulation has been changed, it could easily happen again. And there's now precedent for it. So that's why I think there should be a zone change. I said that a year and a half ago when we had the application, and I'll say it again right now. Should be a minimum lot size and not 1 acre.
But that's Richard, don't disagree with you, but it's a separate issue.
Okay.
I don't think that we either need to or should hold religious institutions to provide sufficient parking for Christmas and Easter. Things that where they get overflow or way over capacity crowds only two or 3 or 4 days a year. I think what we ought to be requiring is parking for what happens probably 49 or so weeks a year. Because, as Richard said, the land is just too expensive, basically to lie fallow most of the year.
See, I agree with that, and I'm not harping on I'm just using as an example how an 18,000 square foot building gets away with 54 parking spaces. And I'm not saying they did anything illegal. They did it. I'm just saying that we should make the buildings to scale.
You're talking about a different issue, and maybe that issue is worth addressing.
All right, then I'll stop talking.
How much land is the minimum for a religious institution. I mean, that's a perfectly appropriate thing for us to address. If it's not an acre, what do we think makes sense? But the question initially before us is, how do we calculate the requirements for parking? If we leave it too loosey-goosey, then it's also loosey-goosey for the institution, and that doesn't really serve our purpose. So we have to come up with something that we're comfortable with, even if it doesn't always work. And then we can address the other issue, that is the property for the institution itself, separately. So we do have in front of us some recommendations for how we ought to do that.
And so this is, the existing regs today is 1 space per 5 seats. So the proposal is to go to 1 space per 3 seats, and then an additional space per full-time employee, which I would imagine would only be 1 or 2 additional spaces. So it is an increase. It's probably based on how more families get to their places of worship now.
Mm-hmm.
That makes sense to me.
I don't have a problem with that either.
Because a lot of the building, like Richard's talking about a 50, blah, 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 square foot building. Well, that whole building was not the equivalent of what they call the sanctuary. That's like saying, a Catholic church, you have to put in the room where they have the coffee hour downstairs, and you have to put the classrooms in for parking, separate parking. That's the square footage of the building, but that has nothing to do with how many seats there are for parishioners. The only weird thing about the Sikh temple was that instead of sitting on pews, they sat on the ground.
Well, let's move on from there. So in
other words, I think this proposal makes sense.
Okay, and that's what I want to get to. Let's do a poll on this one as well. And then we can separately deal with property sizes for religious institutions. So all those who are in favor of the 1 parking space for 3 seats, plus the 1 parking space for each member of the staff. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. That looks like enough hands up. So let's move on. Steve, am I wrong? Have you addressed that issue of size for religious institutions?
We did talk about that, and initially that was the recommendation, was to have twice the minimum lot area and 1.5 times the setback for religious institutions. But our concern after we thought about it was just singling out religious institutions, and then we had circled back to special permit uses in the residential zones and requiring that. And then I think Mr. Cantor had brought up the concern about the idea with corner stores and how would that impact them. So that kind of conversation happened, but never got quite tied up.
Well, certainly there should be no objection, no legal objection to our increasing the lot size, because we currently have a lot size in our regulations. Am I wrong about that?
No, I think the idea would be to say, if you're just going to say for religious institutions that you guys have to have twice the lot size, but then not make it apply across for other special permit uses in residential zones.
Well, how do we
why
do it?
couldn't it be for every special permit use then?
That's what we had talked about doing.
How many seats are there in a corner store?
The concern with the corner store, and it again, you guys.
I mean, it's the same for all of the uses in the residential build area, and a corner store says we don't have any seats.
But it would say if you're doing a non-residential use or a special permit use, I should say, in a residential zone, you're required to have twice the lot area. So it would apply to every single one of them, whether it was a corner store, a church, or whatever else is allowed by special permit.
Is the twice the lot area idea because these religious institutions have times when the capacity is way high? Is that like, what's the purpose behind the twice the lot area?
That idea? And they're more impactful on the neighborhood than what currently goes on in most single family zones with their activities and what, just general what could happen impacts, I guess.
Prayer.
I don't want to discourage corner stores. Excuse me, Anna, I didn't mean to.
Yeah, no, go ahead.
I mean, I think corner stores are something we should be encouraging, and it really enhance a single family or a residential neighborhood. So I would hate to say they have to have 1.5 size the lot. That would really discourage them. There aren't very many lots that size.
And I'll say, so with, if you don't go the route of requiring twice the minimum lot size, by requiring 1 space per 3 seats instead of 5 seats, you've essentially required them to get more lot area anyways, because now they need to come up with more parking area. Plus, their parking is now going to count against their impervious surface coverage. So that parking, that adds to the amount of land that they, so I mean, it's kind of like de facto added already into the regulations.
Good point.
As long as every square foot that's available for, what did you call it, Galen? The part where everybody prays?
The sanctuary, that's what they call it.
Sanctuary, as long as the entire sanctuary is counted. That was my point with that other one. They didn't count the square. I wasn't talking about the whole 18,000.
Square footage of the building. It was
4,000 square feet in the middle of the building.
Brian, can you put that language back up again for that? Because I know the other thing you might want to think about is using the determination of the fire marshal, similar to what we talked about with the funeral homes. So if you have a blank space and it's it can be fitted with pews, it can be fitted with mats, it can be fitted with just freestanding seats. What's the volume of that space? If the fire marshal figures out what the maybe it's a better way to do it. The fire marshal figures out what that volume of the worship space is, and then says we have a dimension for what a seat is, whatever that is, and then divide that by 1 for every 3. And then
why couldn't the applicant's architect do that?
Yeah, I think they would do the math, but the fire marshal would verify that.
Sure.
Yeah, that's a good idea.
Okay.
I'm completely on board with that. Because if somebody wanted to do this under present zoning with a 1 acre lot, I have no problem with that, but the building should be smaller. I think that's what all the people on Richards Avenue were so upset about.
Well, that's already done. So in the future,
I know. I'm especially sensitive because I live on God's holy acre. I've got my whole boundary lines are churches. It's okay.
Well, that's a good place to live.
It is. I'm not complaining too much.
What about the setbacks? Increasing the setbacks, however, I think is a good idea.
I agree with Mike that again, based on what Steve said, that these facilities are more impactful on the neighborhood, that you want a little more separation. And
Stamford has, I remember in a discussion a decade ago, it was about the mosque that was turned down by the zoning commission at the time, and then appealed in a federal lawsuit. and the city lost, right? And that's how,
Right.
you see, if you remember all that, the city spent a couple $1 million, bought the mosque, the old Episcopal church down behind near the library near Mott Street. I forgot the name of that street it's on, but on that park. But anyway, it came up that Stamford had required increased setbacks and increased FAR, which we're not using anymore, but floor area ratio for religious institutions. And that seemed to pass muster with RLUIPA. I don't believe it was ever challenged. So I don't think that a zoning requirement needs to adhere to RLUIPA if there's reasons to, good reasons to do it.
Well, Mike, the whole point is if it applies to all religious institutions,
Yes.
if religious institution can do it as a build as of right, and you say, oh no, not this one because it's got too many, blah, for these reasons, that's not allowed. Because they used to use that against synagogues. These days, mostly it's mosques. It's people see
Right.
these things different.
I'm not saying singling any religion out, of course, so it would just apply.
But you single out new people coming to the area, right? Like,
but
your grandfathered entities that are entrenched already here, but new religions that want to come in need to have higher requirements.
Any new church would have to have it, or a religious institution would have to have it. So it'd be,
you can look at the what is it, the hour that has the classifieds with all the religious services occurring that week and see like the 300 churches and the numbers of everything else, and it's new rules for new religious practices coming into the area.
Steve, is there any reason why we can't do that you're aware of?
Specifically due to what? I'm sorry.
Changing the setbacks and changing the requirement from 1 to 5. I'm sorry, from 1 to 5 to 1 to 3.
No, not at all on the parking. I would just say if you're going to change the setbacks or increase the setbacks I would make it for special permit uses and not just single out religious institutions, because then I think you're running afoul of RLUIPA with that.
I don't have a problem with that.
Well, yeah, but we're circling back around to the corner store issue.
Right. So I think you need to resolve that question, how you want to handle that.
Well, maybe we could try to put together like a test fit for a corner store, because I thought the intent with the corner store was both front setbacks would get reduced so that they could be closer to the street and act as a true corner store. And then maybe that makes the side setbacks less of an issue. If they're pulling the building closer to the street that way, maybe they're going to have additional space to the side and rear that can accommodate that additional requirement. But
that seems at odds with what we want to do with the religious institutions, where we want to lengthen the setback.
It's a different use. It's hard to lump everything in.
Steve, why don't we turn this back to you and the staff? Let's get some legal advice on this and see if you can find a way to thread the needle. You know what it is we're looking for.
Yeah.
Okay.
The clarity on both that funeral home one and this, I think they're probably going to come out pretty similar in terms of the parking, and then we'll clarify with the setbacks.
Okay.
All right, and then the last one, and this one again is tricky, and that's why we're bringing it up to you guys, is commercial rec. So these are kind of your hockey rinks, your indoor tennis courts, indoor volleyball courts, indoor soccer fields, whatever they are. So as currently written in the regulations, I believe there is no parking calculation for it, and it's up to the zoning enforcement officer essentially to come up with an adequate parking number. That's problematic because staff is not really supposed to have a discretionary decision like that. That's sort of your purpose, the Planning and Zoning Commission. You guys have the discretion to kind of have those decisions. So what we were kind of thinking of is there's not really a right number for this, because you could have a volleyball court that becomes a soccer field, that becomes a tennis court, and you're gonna have a different number of people at that facility depending on what the actual sport is that's being played there. So what we were proposing is to give you all the jurisdiction where if somebody comes in proposing a commercial rec space, they'd show you the amount of fields or the sport that they're playing, and they would supply to you a parking management plan saying this is how many parking spaces we think we need. And then that would give you the yay or nay on, do you think that's enough? And then if they in the future were to change programs or sports, they would come back and have to essentially show you that the parking management plan is still applicable for that new program.
Steve, Brian, I don't have any problem with what you're suggesting, just a question. Giving us that somewhat nebulous authority, I can't think of too many other areas in zoning where we have that kind of authority. And so is this a potential problem area for us in the future?
I think with the exception of the fighting robots, anything that would be proposed has been done in so many other towns and so many other areas of the country that it would be up to the applicant to show us what he's proposing and what the parking requirements of other similar venues are. I don't think it would be that hard, except for maybe the robots, and maybe there's more robot places than I know of, but I thought it was kind of unique. But that's a unique.
If I'm the applicant, I'm going to find venues where what I want works.
Well, that's true.
Can we have a peer review in the traffic study that could help us with that?
Yeah, we have TMP, we have peer reviewers available, so
we could use peer reviewers for this.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think the reason with this one and how it popped up is we've had a couple different times where they've changed the use within that facility, and sometimes when you have a use that might be more league driven or tournament driven or more, instructional, where you could have a lot more, could be kids getting dropped off, you end up with different traffic and parking problems that weren't foreseen with the first application. Because if it was simply a zoning standard where it's one parking place per field or court, each sport is different and how they utilize that space is different. So we get stuck just saying, well, it's just the same, and then applying the same standard. That way, I think at least this gives you guys the ability to look at what the programming is going to be to make sure you're comfortable with what they've proposed in terms of their parking management and their parking supply.
Well, if the staff doesn't have a problem with it, I'm good with it.
I'm good with it too, and I wonder if we can apply it to the other like intermittent uses as well. It feels like a good fit for other intermittent uses for them to come to us saying like, hey, this is what we think we need in our area for whatever it may be for their intermittent use. Show other properties that have worked well with that, and have the peer reviewer to help validate that and provide some input on that. I think it will help prevent against one of the issues raised tonight, which is over parking, right? And planning against the maximum occupancy, and having these. I was looking at the satellite view of Norwalk as we were talking here, and it is a lot of parking lots. Would be great to see less and see more of a useful development for folks. So I really like this concept, and curious if we can expand it out to other intermittent uses. Maybe that resolves the corner store issue we were talking about before.
Yeah, I mean, it's always a little. There's a court case from a few years ago called the McKenzie case, and it's always a little dicey when you don't have consistent standards across the board. So it's always better to have, like, especially like with the religious institutions or the funeral home, which I don't honestly, I don't think the funeral home one is ever going to become an issue. If we get one, I just don't think it's going to, but it may. But for a religious institution, it's better if you have a standard, whether that standard is good or bad. At least there's a numerical standard that can be applied, and then you can, whether there's litigation or something, at least you're consistent with the standard. With this, it's a little, to the chairman's point, it's a little nebulous. It's a little, it provides flexibility, which can be good. So I think this is kind of a special case in terms of the activities that go on. I mean, if you go from most, if you're looking at the religious institutions and you have a capacity number based on the fire marshal, then it doesn't really matter if they're sitting on pews or they're sitting on the floor on mats or something. It's still the same quotient. But if you have like a massive rec center, the capacity, you can put thousands of people in there. So you're not going to park it off the fire marshal capacity, because they're not looking at what activity is going on the court. They're saying, all right, it's an assembly area, and I can shove thousands of people in here based on the number of exits and aisle widths and those kind of things. So I think this sports thing is just a different animal in terms of how the activities impact the road network and the existing parking lots.
Okay, let's do a straw poll on this one. All those in favor of the staff's recommendation? It's unanimous. Okay, at least we've got this one out of the way.
We'll get the other ones wrapped up quick.
Good. All right. What have we got next?
Next, we have a couple of definitions. So this is where our robot friends come into play. So in Norwalk, we have this unique user called the National Havoc Robotic League, and it's gained quite a bit of popularity.
It's awesome.
They hold these national events that are, streamed, globally, and they get quite a few. They get people participating from different countries, bringing robots to fight each other at these events. So it's kind of cool. It's unique. It brings people to Norwalk. People are excited about it. So the problem is that their use didn't have a definition under the existing regulations. So what they did was they went to ZBA under a provision that allowed them to temporarily occupy a building on Woodward Avenue for up to 2 years, so that they can get in there, fire marshal and building department can go out and make sure everything is up to code. And then in those 2 years, they can sort of come up with a way to permanently legalize their use. So we said this is a good opportunity with the zoning reg rewrite to add a use that fits for them and get them legalized. So the first part of that is coming up with a definition for what they would fall under. So we had spoken with their attorney and came up with this very specific use for them called the robot competition venue. They were on board with this use or with this definition. We would permit it in the light industrial zone, which is where their current business is running out of, and then potentially allowing this in the CD4C, which is your main Ave and Route 1 corridor. And then we would throw some limitations on top of properties that would be eligible in both of those zones based on lot size and providing you traffic and parking management plans. Because again, when they hold these events, they only hold so many per year, so they get quite a few people coming out to them. I believe they have food trucks that come, and they have vendors. So they're big events, so they're okay with providing these traffic and parking management plans. So again, we think it's a cool use. We want to allow it in Norwalk. We want to get them permitted and have them be a permanent tenant in Norwalk. It's just kind of figuring out the best way to classify them and coming up with a use that everybody's on board with.
I think this is cool also. But is it going to be something that's still being done in 5 or 10 years. And I don't know the answer to that.
I mean, you have a lot of definitions, well, a lot of zoning regulations still refer to slaughterhouses, and
right.
Well, you're not going to get many of those either. But
No.
I think, and if it goes out of style in 10 years, and you just have a definition that's there.
What if
Hasn't this been
go
on
out of
TV
style
for like 20
and
years?
they work out a relationship, say with one of the high schools to hold the competitions there? Does this language permit that use?
Like at the high school?
Yeah.
No, so because what we would do is we limit it to which zones you could actually have this use in, which is just the light industrial and potentially the 4C, depending on your thoughts. So all the schools will be in a civic district, so this use would not be applicable to those zones.
But this is just a use that can be done in an industrial zone. It's not a required use. So if it goes out of favor and it's not popular anymore, that's, nobody's problem but the guy who owns the business. And
Well,
I think he's the property owner too.
It would seem to me that a school would be a good venue for something like this. And
No. You can't. You need special boxes for these things, though. They shoot fire. The blades go off. Like
oh, really?
You're talking about.
Yeah, I'd imagine like the schools, like you probably have a robotics club that.
You have a robotics club. Yeah, these are like effectively little. They can cause serious damage, not contained well. They've done a really good job of containing them, fire suppressant within the containers, a whole host of things to make sure it's really safe. Because imagine like some of these have like saws, circular blades going, trying to attack the other robot, but that can pop off and spin out, and it does. And sometimes it hits, hasn't shattered, but you can see some dents in the plexiglass. That's pretty intense.
Nick, hasn't this been on TV for a long time?
Yeah, it started 15, 20 years ago with
that's
BattleBots.
what I thought. I've seen it a couple of times.
Yeah, and this guy, I think
Crazy.
this guy was the former CEO of Datto, and
Yeah.
he was really into robotics, and he's like, I just want to do it locally. It's pretty cool, and like from like a STEM science perspective, like it really gets kids into thinking about this stuff, which is pretty awesome.
And STEAM is ever evolving, so I'm sure that it will still be here 5-10 years down the line.
We're
I agree.
running short on time. If we don't need to have much discussion on this, I'm comfortable with us just doing a straw poll and approving it. Is everybody okay? Looks like it's unanimous. Okay, good.
All right, there's one more left.
Nice to have one quick one. And Nick, thank you for that information. I was unaware of that.
We should all have a social event where we all happen to show up at one of these in the near future. I think it would be a lot of fun.
Sounds good to me.
And this one, Steve might be able to give you more background on than I could, but this is related to lodges, the definition for lodges. So in the proposed regulations, we have lodging uses like hotels, motels, bread and breakfasts, etc. And then there's the term lodge, but the term lodge was not defined, and it was not permitted in any zone. So it was kind of this, what is it? Why is it here? So I believe the purpose of actually coming up with a definition and then allowing it is for Lakota Oaks because they offer lodging at their facility now. So it would be a special permit use within the CD3L, which is where Lakota Oaks is proposed to be zoned as. And then there would be limitations based on what would constitute a lodge or what property would be eligible to provide lodging in that zone.
Sure looks like spot zoning to me.
Why wouldn't Lakota Oats fall under a hotel definition?
They do more than just a hotel in terms of some of the things that they provide and offer. And the other part of it was that the existing zoning regulations and zoning map have the Lakota Oaks property basically as its own zone, which is kind of unnecessary. So it makes just more sense to keep it as a special permit use within the zone. Technically, you could say, is it spot zoning? No, because anybody who has 60 acres and wants to conserve 30 acres of that could go ahead and put a lodge in their property as well. But the likelihood of that is probably slim to none, but it's still potentially possible.
But so if somebody else wanted to make a lodge that wasn't on the size property that Lakota Oaks is, the answer would be like, what? I know you said it does other things that are different than a hotel, but does that mean it wouldn't meet the requirement of a hotel that we currently have?
When you say the hotel we currently have, you mean in terms of definition, or?
Yeah, in terms of definitions.
I have to look at that. Hold on a sec.
It seems weird to create a type of use for one thing and then make the requirements only match that one thing. And yes, if somebody else had 60 acres, then fine. Like, if you don't really have to do it.
Well, I mean, the alternative was because Lakota Oaks is approved by special permit. The commission's determination at the time was to put it in its own zone. So it's really that zone which benefits that single property, which is probably a worse way to do it. So it's a way to kind of, you're really dealing with a kind of a oddball one-off piece of property. So this way you're not making them, technically you could just make them non-conforming, but I don't think that's necessary in this case. That's why you add the use in, which is a special permit use in the zone. So it's a way to legitimize the activities that have already been approved by the city by special permit.
Say, Steve, what do they do that's different than a hotel?
So they do offer they offer it's almost like the ability, they don't do it very often, but they have the ability to do it like almost like as a conference center. They can use it.
So hotels.
Not always, not all of them. And also they have I don't want to call it a ballroom. I guess it's sort of like a ballroom space where they have that.
So do hotels. You're talking about a place where you can have a company retreat or a bar mitzvah, or you can spend the night. Right. And at this place, you can walk around in nature a lot. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I guess so. It's not. I mean, it's if you've been inside the facility, it's not like a hotel, so it's a little different.
Well, it is, though. I have actually been inside the facility because the West Nowak Association used to do all its Christmas parties. And at one point, they weren't allowed to take single bookings. So I tried to make a single booking, but they were on to me. It was supposed to only be group bookings at that point because they were trying to get around being a hotel.
You can also do education there as well. I think that might be the difference.
Well, you can in a hotel too. I mean,
yes.
I've been to conferences when I worked for big companies where the sales conferences, they used to occasionally have the legal department, which was weird, but it was basically just a outing for the sales force. But they had
because that's what I know it for. Like, let's say, once owned by GE, so they can basically commandeer the entire space for their education programs, the promotion and marketing programs for all of their exclusive guests, as opposed to other guests sharing the space.
You could book, like the Register of Voters just had their conference, their annual conference at this hotel in some weird place in upstate Connecticut, for instance. So all the registrars from all over, and their deputies and blah, blah, blah. And they have
about avoiding paying hotel taxes. Is that what this is?
No,
okay. They put hotels now.
I'm not going to argue it. It just, I don't see the logic, but I trust you that there is logic.
What,
Yeah,
from
again, I
something
think this is
different?
one of those things that you're not going to see another one of these, or you won't see with the limitations that are applied, which is consistent with what the existing property has. It, you know, I don't see somebody buying up 61-acre lots and then putting a hotel out there. Just that the odds of that happening are probably none to none.
Right, but it's just a hotel with a lot of land.
Yeah, and I mean they do have office function. They do have it is and it isn't. I think you could probably say maybe it's very consistent with the hotel definition, but I think it, to me, this adds almost a little bit of more protective layer to not encouraging or discouraging it in a zone like that.
Ah,
All right, let's try a straw poll and see if we have anything approaching unanimity. So, yeah, I see a lot of shoulders going up. Let's see how people feel about the language that the staff has given us, and if we have enough people who are comfortable with it.
But may I try to sway some votes, Mr. Chairman, before you do that?
Go ahead.
This the only thing is then you're going to have to put something in there. There's got to be a definition in or a use that's allowed in the what's going to be the 1L zone that permits what's going on there. With I would say the limitations are probably going to be consistent whether you just call it a hotel or you call it a lodge. I think the idea with calling it a lodge is it's maybe a little different than a hotel. That's really the only reason. Other than that, if that use didn't exist, we probably wouldn't be talking about it now, but it's there. So we're trying to make it legal so that they can operate within the bounds of their existing special permit.
Steve, but couldn't you put those requirements for a hotel in the 1L as a, like, just out of, without calling it a lodge?
You could.
Yeah, you'd have to tweak the hotel definition.
I don't know if that's cleaner or not cleaner in any which way. I honestly don't have a strong opinion on this one. I like the essence of it in the sense that it like gives more protection to in that area, but my brain's a little fried on this one.
that's a good point. Yeah, because as I recall, Steve, they weren't allowed to serve, to have a bar that the public was allowed to come to.
Yeah, I that's why I think just, and again, I understand your point, and normally I would go in the direction of less is more, but I think this is kind of telling them and telling somebody else that this is not a hotel, quite like it's not the Days Inn or the Hilton that you're going to plop out in the middle of West Norwalk. This is like a kind of a one-off use and piece of property that exists, and we're trying to allow them to operate within the bounds of their existing approval, but not opening it up beyond that.
Yeah.
Well, I think the gray area is that we don't know what the existing lines are. We're making assumptions that it may be the same as a hotel or it isn't the same as a hotel. Is there any way that we can see this language which clarifies and clears up any confusion?
Yeah, I can send you the their special permit approval. The uses that are outlined in the proposed lodge definition were taken from that. That's where I got that.
Excellent. So can we table this vote until we see more?
That's fine. I'll dig that. We have a follow-up, so we'll do like a follow-up memo really quick on these kind of outstanding items.
Okay. We only have a few more minutes, so let's keep moving.
All right, and then lastly, this is probably the last one we'll get to is sports courts, and again, Steve can probably go into more detail than I could on this one. So this one has come up, I believe, because a few people in the city have taken their backyards and put in like volleyball courts, and then what they started to do was hold like large volleyball tournaments, and they'd be going on into the wee hours of the night, and the neighbors were not happy, and it was really causing a lot of problems for the neighborhood. So we're kind of trying to come up with a way that you know, still lets you put your volleyball court in your backyard, but doesn't allow you to turn it into a a place to hold volleyball tournaments.
Right. Or pickleball tournaments.
Right. So I believe what Amelia did was she looked at what some other towns had allowed and where they allowed them in terms of sports courts in a typical residential lot, and then tried to come up with sort of like a maximum size and location.
I think, Brian, at the bottom is the staff recommendation.
Yeah, so I think what Amelia did was she looked at your typical, you know, what a volleyball court looks like, what a basketball court dimensions are, tennis court dimensions are, with the idea that you could build one of these on your property today, and we'd continue to allow you to do an over-the-counter permit as of right, as long as it meets or is less than these dimensions. And then if you're proposing anything that exceeds that, it'd be a special permit approval, sort of to get them to explain why they need such a large sports court on their property. Within the proposed zoning regs, we had there's lighting standards. So, you know, lighting is an issue. They put up lights and it causes again a nuisance for the neighbors. So that would be prohibited under the proposed regulations. So that's one more thing where I think we can hopefully prevent it from happening in the future.
And Brian, I think we absolutely want this noise issue addressed. I think it's perfectly appropriate that we not allow public address systems.
Right.
Yeah, I would think you want to do, I mean, the more I think about this, I would think for a sports court, you might need to increase the setbacks for something like that. It might make sense.
All right. Since you don't have a recommendation on increasing those setbacks, and I agree with you, you want to come back to us with specific language on the whole issue?
Yeah, I mean, unless you want to talk about it now quickly, it's up to you. But they would be typically, you know, you could start with twice the setback or 1.5 times the setback or something like. I mean, it's going to probably fall into a category like that.
And then I guess to give you like perspective on what the setbacks. So, for example, like the B residence zone today, which are your smaller lots, 6,250 square feet. Your side setbacks for accessory structure is 6 feet from your side property line, and then 5 to 10 feet. Kind of depends on your lot for a rear. So you're talking what a setback would be 12 feet from the side, and then possibly up to 20 feet from the rear.
I'm not even sure whether that's adequate, especially if you're talking about things like tennis, where balls can go, flying 30 or 40 feet.
Yeah, more than likely in this, if you have a 6,000 square foot lot, it's going to be tough to put some of these structures on there to begin with. You might get like a half court basketball or something. Right. It's going to be hard to put could be your whole backyard at that point. So I think twice the setback is a pretty good starting point for discussion.
All right. A comment on this?
I just hope if we do it, we have enforcement capability, because I worry that this is going to become a thing.
Especially in rear yards that may be hard to see. I think staff's brought that up before, that enforcement in properties that aren't, or areas that aren't visible from the street is really difficult.
Well, the good thing is if you have that in, so right now we don't regulate a lot of these things. So they don't have to necessarily meet setbacks for a tennis court or something like that. So, but now if we're making sure the definition of structure includes these, or it's defined separately, and we're saying that these specific sport courts have to have a twice the setback. Say they just go ahead and build one, and then it's a pretty clear violation at that point, and we can go after them. Right now, we have really nothing to regulate.
Depending on the material, is may count against impervious surface. Is that right?
Yeah, I think pretty much all those surfaces are going to be impervious, even if it's like a cinder dust or something like that. I think it's probably going to be impervious.
Okay.
All right. You want to do a straw poll on this one?
Excuse me, I'm sorry, Lou. Are we talking about as well the other recommendation in the memo, which was including but not limited to examples? You know, because I like that language where it actually lists everything out. Are we going to move on to that, or is that part of this?
As a definition?
Yeah, remember as you scroll down, your memo had
bottom of the first page.
Yeah, the bottom,
swimming pools, tennis courts, towers, paddle.
Yeah, you were talking about adding a list of including but not limited to examples may be helpful in enforcement. There it is. Are we talking about that as well right now, Lou? Because that didn't come up.
No, did Steve?
Yeah, so that would be, it's really like a 2 or 3-fold question, I guess, is adding a separate definition that would include terms like this to structure, or I think, Brian, if you scroll down just a little bit below, that could be a separate definition right there.
So why is handicap ramps on that list?
That from up above is just those are other what are considered structures as well, which come from other, they come from a whole myriad of other towns that we look at.
But are you trying to regulate size and use?
Not for everything. That this memo is specifically dealing with sports courts. I mean, my preference to me is defining what a sports court is, and then it's regulating it as an accessory structure. And then I think, to me, the safest course would be to require twice the setbacks for the sports courts.
But we're defining structure because it's not defined now. Some of these sports courts would be included in the definition. Just because there's other things in the definition of structure doesn't mean that it's getting regulated in any particular way right now. The regulation part that we're discussing right now is about the sports structures. Do I have that correct?
Everything over here makes sense except for the handicap ramps. That's all. That just kind of stuck out to me.
Yeah, I think this is just a list of other towns who have they've included all of these different structure as under a structure. Handicap ramps are extremely, like, I don't think, if you're putting a handicap ramp in, we're not going to tell you can't.
Okay, so can you take that out? It's just a sore thumb. I
don't think. We wouldn't put that in ours.
Thank you.
It's just a compilation of structures and from the research that they got of what other municipalities have.
Right.
All right.
Can we, if we approve this, just like anything else that we've talked about tonight, the public still gets to weigh in on it. It can still get changed. Like, I know there's a lot of people who know a lot more about volleyball courts and funeral homes than we do. And so things can get tweaked, right?
The quick answer is absolutely.
Great. And let's do it.
Yeah, and perhaps
I love this.
And perhaps we could also look into, doing it by zone. Maybe what would be a AAA zone might be able to have a volleyball court, but another zone shouldn't, perhaps. And then we could use it like a pickleball court. But
sorry,
that's getting into the weeds.
Okay, so all those in favor of the staff recommendation? Okay. That one's unanimous too. One less thing we need to worry about at the moment. With that,
thank you.
It's just
thank you for doing this.
It's just about 8 o'clock. Steve, do you have any comments?
No, I think we're getting pretty close to the end of these. Brian has a couple memos he's working on. I mentioned I have one more that I'm just about done with. And then I think in 2 weeks will be the sustainability / flood zone discussion, which will probably be a pretty lengthy discussion on that. We have some changes to that, and then once the other memos were done, we'll send those out, and then maybe we have 2 more meetings like this outside of your normal course of business. And I'm sure there's going to be things that people bring up or things we forgot. And obviously, if there's anything you want to circle back on, or you have questions on how it was left, we can discuss that at any point in time as well.
Okay. Do you want us to email you, Steve, if there are specific things?
Yes.
Steve, do you know anything about BJ's?
Yeah, that was the most overblown story of the century. So I was out Thursday, Friday last week, and so there was a bunch of emails that came into me that I was just at a conference, so I didn't get to. But the owner's rep had reached out to me a week or 10 days ago and said they were going to be clearing the site, removing all the scrub brush, cleaning up piles of stuff, making it more presentable, because they're going to start marketing it and just thinking about some things to do. They don't have any specific proposal. So I said, okay, from what you're describing to me, you don't need any zoning permits, but I referred them to the building department and public works. So they went ahead and started the work. And then the neighbors got concerned that BJ's was going to start popping up there. And I said, well, no, there's no permits. They're just cleaning up and getting rid of stuff. So that's it.
Good. Thank you for that. Okay.
It's not going to be a BJ's, right?
I don't think so, but they haven't submitted anything. So that approval's still on the table, but
Nobody knows.
I don't believe that's in their current plans.
Any other comments or questions from members?
Just kind of a personal one from me to Steve. I'm wondering if you could send me a link how to get onto the old zoning code, because no matter what I do, it keeps bringing me back to the new code.
Oh, yeah, I'll send
I tried to look something up this morning. I couldn't find it.
Okay, yeah, I can do that right now.
Thank you.
Sure.
Anything else? All right. Well, I think this was fairly productive, and look forward to seeing you all next week. Same time, same place.
Okay.
Take care.
Good night, all.
Good night.